I want to talk to you specifically about something that I saw in the Beige Book, and I wanted to pick it up with you on Friday after the jobs report. The fact that some firms are relaxing drug testing standards and also relaxing restrictions on hiring those with criminal convictions or felons in the United States. Talk us through this.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting anecdote, as you said, in the Fed's Beige Book report that they put out last week. And of course, you know, we've been writing stories, some other newsletters have been writing stories over the last year or so about how not only are businesses start to hire, you know, former felons, but they're also going directly into prisons and hiring people who are still in prison to work, mostly in manufacturing jobs is kind of where we're seeing this. But it's a really interesting trend. And a lot of people look at this and say, wow, tightest labor market ever, right? This is like a clear sign that the labor market's getting really tight. But it goes back to something we were discussing on Friday, which is to what extent is this actually less about like the most demand for labor ever and just more of a story of how much policy has destroyed the supply of labor over the last several decades. So this first chart that we're looking at here is from the latest report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it shows incarceration rates over the last several decades have really surged and are now, you know, multiple times more than they were in the 70s. And a large part of this was obviously, you know, the war on drugs and a lot of stepped up enforcement of various other things. And so this is something that has really damaged labor supply, and especially for African American men. And so this was one of the things we were looking at on Friday, was that high elevated non-employment rate for all men in general, but especially for African American men. So I wanted to just show you guys another chart.
Which we have here on my Bloomberg. Labor force participation rates among African American men. And the yellow line at the bottom here, Matt, is for black men aged 45 to 54, 79.5%, compared with the blue line at the top, which is for black men aged 35 to 44.
Yeah, and so the bottom line here, as you can see in this chart, labor force participation for prime working age African American men is down a lot from before we sort of saw that major trend start to take effect in the 80s and 90s. So what you can see, of course, at the far right end of the chart is that these are starting to come up now over the last 2 or 3 years or so. And so this is kind of what you're seeing. It's part and parcel of that. You know, employers are going into places where they haven't in the past. And so that's why we're starting to see these stories about them going directly into prisons. Now, of course, as the last chart shows, part of the reason for that is that if you put everyone in prison, then you might have to go to those prisons in order to find labor once you get to that point. And so that's just kind of the big picture there.
So even though they've been rising, especially at this stage of the cycle, just incredible ground lost in the last several decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Those labor force participation rates are still very low. And so to the extent that we start to see these anecdotes in the Beige Book about some firms are relaxing standards, starting to, you know, look the other way on drug tests, if that's really a big thing here that's holding back labor supply, and that's a shift that we're starting to see, that trend possibly has a lot of room to run and possibly could open up a lot more new labor supply.
It reminds me of a chart that Torsten Slok of Deutsche Bank talked to us about when he said that 1 in 3 Americans have been arrested by the age of 25, and they've been arrested for non-traffic violations. So even if you're looking for arrests or some kind of criminal activity here on someone's resume or in their past, I mean, when you've got stats like that, it gets tough to find somebody that's completely clean here.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, those labor force participation rates don't include people who are in prison, but what they do include is all the people who have since come out of prison and are having trouble finding
getting a
work.
job. Yeah.
Sure.